So last weekend, all of us priests here at the cathedral introduced 3 themes we want to preach on this whole month. You might remember live, grow, and act. 3 simple verbs, live, grow, and act. Today I want to preach about the gospel, but I also briefly want to touch on how it leads us to act, to do good works, and to make a difference in our local community. First of all, I want to clarify something we hear in the gospel today. Jesus tells us that if we come to him without hating our family and our own lives, we can't be his disciples. It's important to know that this isn't Jesus contradicting his call to love one another. It's actually a matter of language. So for example, let's say we have a friend that talks way too much, okay? And you tell me, wow, he's really talkative. Then I say back, yeah, he almost speaks from his elbows. And then you look at me and say, what? Well, in Spanish, a very common expression for talkative people is el habla hasta por los codos. Literally, he speaks almost from his elbows. But if you don't speak Spanish, that just sounds really, really weird, and you have no idea what I'm talking about, okay? So the gospel passage is actually very similar in this respect. All of the authors of the scriptures were either Jews or heavily immersed in Judaism and the Hebrew language. So although the Greek and our English translation of this gospel literally reads, if anyone comes to me without hating his family and his own life, in Hebrew, that simply means if you prefer your own life and your family over me, you cannot be my disciple. So now we at least know that Jesus isn't encouraging us to hatred, right? He's not contradicting himself, but we're not off the hook because it's still quite the challenge. If we want to be Jesus's disciples, we need to love him more than our family and more than our own life. So I can't explain that one in a fancy way, like Jesus is super serious about that one, okay? And just like Jesus, we need to be willing to take up our cross and even die for him. So where do we go from here? This isn't to say that we stop loving our family or even ourselves. It merely has to do with the ordering of our loves. What comes first, what comes second, and so on. The proper ordering of things we love speaks to the supernatural virtue of charity. Several weeks ago, I preached on charity at the 9 a.m. Mass, and I believe Father Camus stole my homily and also preached a little bit about it here. So, even though it's familiar, it's the most important virtue in our Catholic faith. The most important virtue. So, I'm happy for people to hear about it again and again, to ponder it anew. So that said, it's good to know that charity, in this case, doesn't mean giving your old coat away to Goodwill or spending a few hours working at St. Vincent de Paul. That's usually what it means in English. But in our Catholic faith, it has a very specific meaning. The Catechism of the Catholic Church formulates it very nicely. Charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for his own sake. And our neighbor, sorry, let me try that again. Charity is the theological virtue by which we love God above all things for his own sake, and our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. When we exercise charity, we love God more than our family and more than our very own life, just as Jesus says. This should sound familiar. Every single thing we do is ordered toward love of God, and all other things, mother, brother, sister, father, possessions, interests, our life, play a smaller role. We keep God as the reason and end of all our actions. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was told something along these lines growing up, I was told something along these lines growing up, and while I knew it was important to act for God and do things for God, I didn't always exactly understand what that looked like or what it meant. One thing that helped me immensely in my understanding of charity is a little insight from St. Thomas Aquinas. He identifies a more general definition of charity, and it's very simple. Friendship with God. Friendship with God. When we exercise charity, we live a life of friendship with God. Now, to further clarify, friendship has 2 essential elements. One essential element is an exchange of true goodwill between both persons. You don't simply love their company, and you don't only love their usefulness. True goodwill means to love another person for their own sake. So for example, if I appreciate and esteem Deacon Doug, but only because he's a good deacon at my masses, that's only a friendship of utility. And if I join being with Father Sperry, but only because I love to talk about special kinds of coffee with him, that is simply a friendship of pleasure. Friends not only take pleasure in each other's company, they don't only just enjoy each other's usefulness, appreciate their usefulness, but ultimately they love each other simply for their own sake, simply because they are lovable. This is what the Catechism means when it mentions loving God for his own sake. We don't love God merely because he brings us pleasure and delight, or because of all the things he provides for us. We love him because he is supremely good and supremely lovable. That is what it means to have true goodwill for God. So there's one element. The other essential part of friendship is that both friends know that they have goodwill for each other. So for example, I can will Deacon Tony's good all I want. I can be super kind and enjoy his company and mow his lawn and help him with his deacon duties, out of true goodwill even. But if this is all going over his head and he doesn't register the fact that I'm trying to be kind, that I'm trying to be his friend, we don't actually have a friendship. We don't have a friendship, properly speaking. I might be acting friendly, but friendship is not entirely one-sided. In friendship, there's not only mutual goodwill, it's mutually recognized. It's mutually known. Friends not only love each other, they know that they love each other. They know that they love each other. So there are the two important elements of friendship: mutual goodwill between both persons, a true love simply for the sake of the other, and a mutual recognition of this goodwill. Both persons know that they love each other for their own sake. When these two elements are truly lived with God, we exercise the virtue of charity. And while I think that any practicing Catholic knows that we must do all things out of true, selfless goodwill for God, it is a deep refreshment to our souls, brothers and sisters, when we remember that friendship with God in its essence is a two-way street. It's in its essence a two-way street. We not only have goodwill for God, but God also has goodwill for us. What's more, God invites us to know that he loves us. He invites you into a tender and deeply felt exchange of love. Tender and deeply felt exchange of love. God recognizes that you love him, and you too can rest in the truth that he loves you simply because you're lovable. This brings us back to Jesus' challenge. True charity demands that we love Jesus above mother and brother and sister and father and even our own life. But the silver lining, I guess you could say, is that true charity is a deeply known exchange of love with someone who loves us infinitely. It's not as if we can't love our family and ourselves either. We don't lose anything when we love God above all other things. As a matter of fact, when we live charity with God, we are made free to love our family, our neighbor, and ourselves more deeply than we could ever imagine. If we truly love God for his own sake, then we recognize and love him for the perfect wisdom of his creation. We recognize and admire that he has not created humans as isolated, single individuals, but as a community. True love for God bursts forth in a desire to love our neighbor, which he has given us. So that person to your right, that person to your left, God in a special way has given them to you to love them as well. So as I mentioned at the beginning of my homily, charity moves us to act, to do acts of love for our neighbor out of love for God, just as the Catechism says. You might remember me saying that charity is not just folding up your coat and giving it to Goodwill, or volunteering at St. Vincent de Paul. But now that we know a little bit more about charity, a genuine response to God's love is acts of love for our neighbor. And yes, giving an old coat or a food box to someone in need is a great way to do this. I encourage you primarily to ask for a deep renewal of charity in your hearts at this Mass. You received its first inklings at your baptism, and God only desires for us to grow deeper and deeper in this exchange of love with Him. But I also encourage you to ask God for some very concrete and simple ways that you can act on this gift of charity right here in your own community. We have many ministries here at the cathedral, so they could be a perfect way. As we present the gifts at the offertory and proceed into the Eucharist, ask Jesus for an ever-deepening charity and a heart to act in response to this love.